Hello and welcome.
Probably the most interesting thing about Kiss is the legend surrounding the band. After all, Kiss tells you who they are. They consistently project a certain image, and they expect you to believe it. Their history is part fact and a lot of fiction, which is the defining feature of a legend. The Kiss legend started to emerge with their breakthrough album, Alive. This album, released in 1975, was a live compilation of their first 3 albums, none of which had significantly charted. But the live single version of Rock and Roll All Night managed to get some radio airplay, unlike the studio version. From there, the band got traction and started gaining in popularity. What makes this live album notable, aside from the fact that it finally put the band on the record charts, is it really isn't live. The live recordings are a first draft, so to speak. It's significantly overdubbed, with new vocals, guitar parts, and the audience reaction is boosted throughout. But it was marketed as an actual live album that reflected the bombastic energy of the band's live performance, even though it really didn't. It was all manufactured in a studio, which is why it was called Alive, not Live. Looking back, this is a significant event in the band's career, because the band and its management realized that reality is basically irrelevant when you're selling an image. In some ways, the band were a group of proto-influencers who only endorsed and sold one product, themselves. So, while the band didn't have great album sales, they definitely had a talent in marketing themselves and their image. With this realization, Kiss merchandise began to proliferate, generating an income that eclipsed the band's album sales. This conveniently brings us to Marvel Super Special number 1. The overall goal of the Super Special was to promote the image of Kiss as a rock and roll supergroup of actual superheroes. It was a completely ridiculous premise, but it would be adopted as the basis for the forthcoming movie Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, which was scheduled to film the following year. So, to establish the superhero image prior to the movie, it was decided that a comic book should be produced. After all, comic books were the medium where superheroes thrived. At the time, Marvel Comics was the largest publisher of comic books, and they were heavily into licensed properties. One such property, Conan, was a favorite of Gene Simmons, the bass player and leader of Kiss. So, naturally, Kiss's management approached Marvel to produce a comic book based on the band. The legendary writer, Steve Gerber, was hired to script the comic book. Additionally, he was deeply involved in the entire production. According to Gerber, the management and editorial staff, including Stan Lee, were not invested in the project. Uncharacteristically, Marvel did the bare minimum promoting this comic, even within their own titles. The vast majority of advertising and promotion was handled by Kiss management. This allegedly happened because Marvel was concerned about the brand association between Kiss and Marvel Comics. These concerns were mostly due to a scathing article written about the magazine prior to its publication. As a result, Marvel kept their distance. In fact, you can see this cautious attitude play out in the pages of the magazine itself. At one point, various Marvel characters appear: Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, and the Defenders, and all are wary of getting involved in the plot. There are, literally, 21 Marvel superheroes who decide to sit on the bench and see what happens. Even the Hulk, who's not exactly known for his restraint, decides he has better things to do. Prior to the Super Special, Kiss made their first comic book appearance in Howard the Duck, a title also written by Steve Gerber. Kiss appears on the final page in issue 12 and the first 3 pages of issue 13. This appearance is superfluous and makes little sense. But this was a series whose main character was a talking duck, and his nemesis was a man called Dr. Bong. So this strange, unnecessary appearance just added to the atmosphere. The basic story in the Super Special is this. 4 friends get handed a stolen special box containing 4 totems. These totems imbue the group with superpowers. The actual owner of the magic box, Dr. Doom, demands the group's obedience. The reasoning being, since they can't give the stolen power back, they have to do Doom's bidding as he's the rightful owner of those powers. The 4 disagree and escape. They have 2 filler side adventures before confronting Dr. Doom again. Doom has a moment of clarity and allows the group to go free. The story itself is rather bland, with barely any characterization and a plot so thin it's practically invisible. In part, the script was secondary to the artwork and production. Not to mention, there were a lot of people who had a voice in exactly how the band was to be portrayed. The end result is something you get from a generic Hollywood action movie. The characters are pretty much what you expect them to be, and action scenes are contrived to occur at specific intervals. The overall conflict is mildly ridiculous and extended well past its expiration date. Essentially, all of these aspects are signs of a script created by committee rather than a single creative voice. Whether intentional or not, this two-page spread reveals the power structure of KISS. There's Gene Simmons taking up an entire page, then Paul Stanley, whose figure is a reasonable size in comparison to Gene's, and, finally, Peter Criss and Ace Frehley, both of whom are kind of small and occupy the same plane in one's field of vision. Looking at this image, it's not surprising both Criss and Frehley would depart the band a few years later. Their importance to the band is to be smaller background characters. They fill out the space that Simmons and Stanley allowed them to have. This is somewhat reflected in the comic itself. Simmons has the most power. He's a fire-spewing demon with living platform boots. Stanley controls people with emotion. Frehley can teleport, but not very well. And Criss is a cat. So Simmons and Stanley are the most developed and defined, while Frehley and Criss are, well, the other two members of the group. Again, this insight is probably not intentional, but being able to look back in time, it is interesting to see the reality of the band's hierarchy bleed into the comic. Out of the 64 pages, 18 pages are devoted to text pieces about the band, or overt ads promoting their albums and fan club. In fact, the overall product feels like a very professional fan club type of publication. So the priorities of Super Special No. 1 do seem skewed in one particular direction, and that's to be an extended illustrated advertisement for KISS, featuring KISS. Admittedly, that's a rather cynical assessment. However, considering the motivation behind the project, it's difficult not to view this comic through a very specific lens. It's not entirely devoid of charm, as Gerber's playful oddball style does manifest at points. But the end result is not a very good indicator of the writer's talent. After all, this is someone who made an obnoxious talking duck and a non-verbal walking pile of sludge into interesting reads. Not only that, but he wrote one of the most bizarre stories ever published by Marvel and introduced the most random character in the history of comics, Elf with a gun. In other words, despite the subject matter, this is a pretty tame entry in the writer's bibliography. But Gerber was the first writer to script a KISS adventure, so there's that. Ultimately, the appeal of this super special is as a novelty, and perhaps that's the merits it should be judged on. It's a weird little trinket from a weird little time in comic book history, so in that context, debating its merits is rather pointless. Notoriously, all the band members had blood drawn and mixed with the ink. The process itself was documented in the magazine. The point of this gesture was to prove the band gave it all to their fans. They were even willing to give their blood. To quote Nathan Explosion, "That's so metal." The process was officially documented and witnessed by a notary public to give it some legitimacy. So yes, KISS did actually have blood drawn, and that blood was mixed with the red ink used to print that magazine. There was a subsequent rumor that this ink was accidentally used for an issue of Sports Illustrated. However, that rumor has never been substantiated, and it's very likely false. In the end, Marvel Super Special No. 1 is an interesting oddity. It's less of a comic book and more of an artifact, like a pet rock or a BJ and the Bear t-shirt. And you know what? Maybe that's all it needs to be. Until next time.